Thank you so much. I'm going to be looking at some notes here, and I'm just very grateful that I've been given this opportunity to speak, and Buju and Miigwech for that. I am the Tribal Stork Preservation Officer up at White Earth, and I wish I could be with you in person today. There's a lot going on up here, and I'm a staff of one, so I appreciate your understanding. I want to say that we've been engaged in this Truth Project for the entirety of this year. We went through a good solid week-long training on research that has already been done, very similar to what we're hearing today, just as a jumping off place. And that for me really became this moment where I could see just how many hours it would take to be in an archive space, that there's additional information that we still need to find. There's boxes, I'm sure, that haven't been digitized and gone through. There's final dollar amounts that have yet to be calculated, but we have a suspicion of kind of where things are going, right? We've heard some of that this morning. And so the approach that I took was a little different in the sense that I spoke more with community rather than looking at the archives themselves, because I really wanted to hear what people were thinking here. And I also did a lot of my own reflections in that I sit as Tipo, and so most people would think that I'm only focused on history. However, I can see how things repeat themselves. I can see how legacies carry on. I can see how a land grab of the past is affecting families today. And so it was a really interesting project for me to be working on this, and the conversations were not easy ones to have, right? These are not easy reflections to have, but they're necessary. And so I want to thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge how painful a lot of this has been for those doing the research that are from Indigenous communities. And so it's possible for us to look at land grabs and resource extractions and just overall knowledge grabs and look at how this is affecting tribal nations today, individuals today, the education system today, on the reservations, off the reservations. While at the same time, these endowment funds for the university have continued to grow and professional careers have continued to flourish. So there's a imbalance here. And my hope is that this work continues after this Truth Project symposium today concludes, right? So there's still work to be done in the archives. There's a lot of work to be done within future planning within administrations and finance. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of relationships with tribes and with students. And so, my hope is that we continue with all of this. And so I also wanted to say that with that, institutional will would become very necessary, right? It's not enough to just say that we're going to do this project, we're going to allocate these research funds, we're going to conclude in May, and then things are going to be okay after that. So my hope is that, again, we keep doing the providing the funding and the time necessary to continue going through these archives. So in some way, we're able to digitize a lot of this stuff so that community members, tribal representatives who can't physically make it into an archives, they have that access. They can pull something up and be able to look at it. They can use it in the classroom. They can use it in a planning meeting. That there's just greater access overall. And, also who knows the connections that community members are going to make when they have access to the materials themselves. They'll be able to look at this and say, oh, and then there's this other thing, right? That's important. And that's going to also provide us with a fuller story of what took place and where we should go next. So I do want to say that one of the things that did come up in speaking with folks is that tuition waiver piece. It is critical, but beyond need-based and thinking more broadly in terms of who is Native and how enrollment kind of plays a bit of a challenge. Up this way, it is not at all uncommon to have a child who is, fully Indigenous, but have parents with multiple tribes on each side and not enough blood to make enrollment in any particular tribe. And so would this child be excluded, under that particular policy? I think we can think bigger and we can think more broadly. Another piece that came up during our January training was information would be presented in such a way where it would go so far and then it would stop. And it would stop because a comment would be made that, the attorneys for the university, it said that this can't be done or this can't be done. And so I would really strongly advise the university to consider consulting with additional attorneys who work really well in Indian country, Native attorneys, because a lot of the context of these conversations that came up, it absolutely can be done. We just need to think differently about how to do that. And, a university attorney, it's very difficult, I'm sure, right? I mean, you have to manage everything, every possible law and outcome. And so it's hard to specialize in any one thing. And so when you come up with a painful topic like this and a situation like this and a legacy that's, over 100 years old, right? It's important to bring in those that have thought about this for a long time. And so attorneys, bringing them in, I think that's critical. Becoming familiar with which tribes have IRBs in terms of proposed research, I think that's important. But also knowing that if a tribe doesn't have their own research board, that usually that means that the council is also approving or analyzing, and voting on if they're going to approve a certain research project. So that's important, having that relationship. And it may even be beneficial to have a research review committee within the university comprised of representatives from different tribal nations to look at this, because we have situations where we have some folks within the university that are looking at wild rice and doing their research and doing it in collaboration with tribes. And we have others that have not necessarily followed that same path. How do you police that? A lot of times tribes are the last to know, and the damage may have already been done at that point. So just structuring and involving community from the beginning in that planning process, from the onset, and making sure that you have additional specialists you can consult with that are attorneys that know this world and can think bigger. I think that's important to consider. In addition to the tuition waivers, there was a strong response for support for the wellness of students overall. I mean, especially after the past 2 years, we all value and can see how important mental health is just for everyone across the board. But Native students have long had additional struggles with retention. There's a lot that's pulling at them and not necessarily a lot of support. We recognize that. This has been studied, it's been documented, people have written books about it. So, we could do something about that. making sure that we have uh, Native representation in terms of faculty, administration, researchers. I think all of that is important, and all of that came up in our conversations. Part of this work would also include addressing the legacy of boarding schools, which would include the Morris campus. And I would like to say a thank you to Dr. Whalen and Acting Chancellor Janet Erickson, because we did engage in conversations throughout this process. And I'm happy to be part of the search for unmarked burials when that time comes. And I think that having that tribal involvement will be critical. The way that I have personally, from my perspective, advised as we move forward is to use non-destructive means such as ground penetrating radar, having spiritual people there to help guide the process, having TIPOs there to help guide the process, but also having a plan. What happens if you find someone? What happens if you don't? Doesn't mean that they're not there, right? How do you protect that space and honor that space? But also, how do you protect the wellness of those who are living right now, the students that are there, the community that hears that news if you do find someone? That wellness system, that really, really matters. We need to have, we just need to have the resources in place. And that also includes the communities. So if Morris goes and we do a search and someone is located, how are we also supporting communities when they hear that? So, all of these types of things are linked. They're all important. And that search, finding out and moving through that process, that does need to happen. The fact that there are limited wellness resources shouldn't end that. It should, I guess, prompt us all to look at how we can best support each other and do this work. And so I would be calling on the university to encourage that, to make that available. Let's see, I'm making sure I'm getting all everyone's comments here. Another piece that came up when looking at the permanent university endowment, the funds that were made off of mineral leasing, the fact that we don't have a total dollar amount yet, we have an estimate, right? There was a contrast that kept being noted about how tribes often have to struggle to have their own archive centers, their own cultural centers, their own spaces, right? Like they struggle to keep the doors open. And institutions across the country have large endowments. They have collections of all of these items and materials and sacred things. And so there's a very stark contrast there. And just in talking with communities here, partially with the legacy of boarding schools and partially with this desire to have knowledge home again, we came up with this list, in different conversations. Certainly not everybody. I haven't been able to talk to everybody, but we've come up with this list among different conversations that I've had where, I've said, well, okay, what was disrupted? What happened? What was lost? And, the usual type of items made on the list, right? And people talked about family structures. They talked about language. They talked about their overall wellness and self-esteem and just knowledge of their own family history, all kinds of things like that. Ceremony, access to food, access to be able to gather in gathering places and such, right? And so, just within my own mind here, I took all of that and I started thinking to myself, initially years ago, there was a plan for a museum of some kind, and that's sort of shifted into this concept of an archives and wellness center, an ability, a space that's built for the purpose of community members being able to access, so that they can be able to connect with documents or items or sacred things, something that helps them connect more with themselves. So if you want to learn more about enrollment or something that happened within, maybe files for your family that are connected to boarding schools, that you'd be able to do that. But in addition to an archivist and a conservationist and folks like that, there would be people who are trained in trauma, who are trained in going through historic trauma and working with you, so that help you be able to locate those documents, even if it's logging in and seeing files that are at the university or elsewhere. You would be being able to sit with somebody and help understand how that affects the family, but also work through, what do we do with this knowledge once we have it? Be space for language learning, space for ceremony. And the question that kept coming back at me is, okay, how do you pay for that? How do you pay for that? And then I kept seeing all these endowments, and it's like, man, what if all these different institutions could contribute to these tribal endowments that could keep a space like that open and provide that access for the people, So that's something that's come up in conversation. Looking at all the health research, again, that goes back to wellness, right? So we need to be better about how institutions are allowed to research different communities and without necessarily consent at the very, very beginning, at the initial birth of the idea, right? Social services, we need to look at that. And a lot of that training takes place at universities. So just an overall restructuring. And these are the types of things that kept coming up again and again with the community, is to be able to access this knowledge that's within the archives, to look at the totality of that legacy, to actually have numbers and facts and dates and acreage and all that stuff together, and to be able to apply that to pick out those patterns that are still persisting today, right? That inequality, all of that. And then to have a plan moving forward that's going to address overall wellness for people. So that, I think these were the themes that kept coming up within the community. So I wanted to share that. And, I'm writing a larger report that will have, details and such in there, but I know that there are other speakers too. So I just wanted to share, what these conversations have been like over the past 5 months. Thank you.